Crimea matters terribly to President Putin. I mean, this was the territory that he seized back illegally in 2014, and he offers Crimea as his great victory in terms of recreating the empire of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. If he were to lose it, undoubtedly, there would be a pretty big reaction in the Kremlin.
Ukraine's Navy chief has told The Times that he is now thinking about how his Navy can attack Crimea. Crimea was taken by Russia back in 2014. It captured much of the Ukrainian Navy and has since seemed near impregnable. Since then, could it ever be retaken? Joining us this morning is the former Director General of RUSI, Professor of Defence Studies and Security Analyst Michael Clarke. Morning, Michael.
Yes, good morning.
How doable is this then? Because we're so used to where we think that the areas of fighting are in Ukraine, particularly in the east. Crimea has always felt like a pretty hard target for Ukrainian to take. Is it on the table? Is it accessible now, do you feel?
It's accessible, but it's not the same as taking it. It would be a very hard nut to crack militarily. Not impossible, but not in the short term. But what the Navy chief was really saying, which was the truth, is that they've built up enough forces, not a formal navy. They never had much of a navy. They didn't have time to build it up before the invasion started. But they've built up coastal defenses, and they've got a lot more missiles, and they've got these robotic boats now, these automatic drone boats, which have penetrated Sevastopol harbor on at least 2, maybe 3 occasions even. And of course, they sank the Moskva with missiles. So the Ukrainian Navy is able now to control most of what happens in the western part of the Black Sea, rather than leave it to the Russians. And they could threaten Crimea. And that's the point. The Ukrainians, in the next few months, if they're successful in their offensive, which will begin, we think, in the next month, they may be in a position, both by land and sea, to threaten Crimea, to threaten the Russian naval base at Sevastopol, which is very, very important to the Russians, both emotionally and logistically, and also Russian forces in Crimea. So, making Crimea vulnerable is entirely plausible, but then moving in and taking it would be a different proposition for sometime later in the war, I would guess.
And by making it vulnerable, presumably, does that mean that the Russia sends some of its forces down to Crimea, which might make the assault in the east more likely to succeed for Ukraine?
Yes, I mean, they would have to. There's only 2 routes out of Crimea. By road and rail. There's sort of a northeast and a northwest strip. If you look at a map, Crimea is only very tenuously connected to the mainland of Ukraine, and so those routes, are both, good and bad for defenders and attackers because they're so narrow. And it's entirely plausible that the Russians would then feel that they need to reinforce Ukraine in case reinforce Crimea in case the Ukrainians decided to try to make an assault on the peninsula itself. So it would open up a new front in the war, an active front for Russia, which would be beneficial to Ukraine because it would be something else for the Russians to have to worry about. And don't underestimate. I mean, that would be escalatory in war terms because Crimea matters terribly to President Putin. I mean, this was the territory that he seized back illegally in 2014, and he offers Crimea as his great victory in terms of recreating the empire of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. If he were to lose it, undoubtedly, there would be a pretty big reaction in the Kremlin.
Yeah, and that's interesting to know what that reaction would be, because you could make the case, could you not, Michael, that losing Crimea would be curtains for Putin because it's so linked to his prestige and the prestige of the nation.
Yeah, I think that's entirely plausible. It would depend on what else is going on in Moscow, but it would be the biggest blow that Putin had ever taken in his career, which goes back to 1999, and it would be pretty consequential. But as I say, the immediate objective can achieve quite a lot of that by threatening Crimea, because if the Ukrainians can put Crimea in a sort of in a vice, so that they can pressure it at will, which is exactly the way the Russians would do it if the boot was on the other foot. If they could do that, then the Russians will have to think about how far they're going to push this war, because if it were to cost them Crimea, then clearly the war would be massively counterproductive.
Really interesting stuff. We'll have to see what happens in this spring offensive. Michael, thank you for joining us. That's Michael Clarke there, the former Director General of RUSI, Professor of Defence Studies and Security Analyst.
And if you like that,
you can listen to us.
We're sticking asthma. Have you forgotten?
Well done. Every Monday to Thursday on Times Radio Breakfast.